Hello, and welcome to our next presentation. On behalf of the MIT CDOIQ Virtual Symposium, we would like to thank all of our sponsors who have continued to support the symposium during this very challenging year. Before we thank our partners, we'd like to ask that sometime during the symposium's breaks that you visit our partners' virtual booths. You can also visit the Content Hub on the MIT CDOIQ website for some great partner resources. We'd like to thank the following partners: Deloitte, Informatica, Privacy Analytics, CDOIQ, Fusion Alliance, KPMG, Sandal Consultants, Tamer, Alation, Ali Data, Big ID, Boomi, Caserta, Citizen, Data Kitchen, Garage, Wakira, Pylog, Click, ThoughtSpot, Eckerson, Global IDs, Snowflake, Starburst. And as I said, please make every effort to visit our partners, use the virtual passport, because without them and our partner support, the symposium could not be held. Thank you.
Good afternoon. We're extremely excited to have Satyen Sangani with us today. Satyen is the CEO of Alation, and he's a co-founder. Before Alation, Satyen served nearly a decade at Oracle, where he ran the financial services and warehousing and performance management group. He also holds a master's in economics from the University of Oxford and a bachelor's from Columbia University. Today, he's going to cover data catalogs as a platform for data intelligence. Increasingly, data catalogs are used in applications beyond their search and discovery roots, addressing new use cases such as data governance, cloud, data migration, and digital transformation. So with no further ado, we would like to hear the presentation that Satyen has for us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that kind introduction. And welcome everybody to my talk about data catalogs and how they can be a platform for data intelligence. It's obviously odd to do this, and I think all of us would be preferring to do this in person over at MIT. But I think stylized with sort of the academy, I'm going to try to give a little bit of an academic topic in some sense around the space and the market and the evolution of data broadly with the data catalog, and maybe even spend some time defining terms. There's lots of stuff that we talk about more broadly: data intelligence, data culture, data catalogs, and these things mean a lot of different things to lots of different people. And so what I wanted to try to do was to, in this talk, kind of decompose them and talk about some of the relationships and talk about where we as a market participant, see these things going. And I'll give a little bit of my background through the talk. So, hopefully that'll give you some sense for, our point of view. Broadly, the outline for the presentation is to cover 4 areas. First of all, to define this notion of data culture. The second is to talk a little bit about this idea of data intelligence and what that's all about. The third is to talk about this idea of a data catalog, which I think is relatively new. Now maybe something that most folks have heard of, but perhaps still newer than other parts of the space. And then finally talking about how they all relate to the other. So look, I'm going to start with some basics, and I think it's important, especially when we're defining terms, to talk about some things that are sort of obvious, because I think, on some level, wisdom is looking at sort of the same thing, but perhaps from a different point of view. So I think, look, obviously the world is changing very quickly. I think 2020, has taught us that, if nothing else. And I'm sure even before 2020, most of us were convinced of the fact that there is so much evolution in the world around us: trade relations, race relations, our relationship to our climate, our relationship to, the political world. All of this stuff is happening really quite fast. And the result, if you look at the center, is that our businesses are changing and our organizations are having to react extraordinarily quickly to all of that change. Nothing really earth-shattering in that statement, but obviously it's true that your organization is changing as well. And so if we think about sort of the world, coming into the organization, there's also the organization sort of, broadly moving out to the world. And so data, the data that your organization collects is, obviously as a response to a lot of this change, but also as a response to all the technology that you're creating and implementing, is getting created at a massive level. Your workforces are constantly changing. There's turnover, restructurings, M&A, and obviously there's this huge trend around remote work, which we certainly slot into. And then finally, of course, there's the evolving legal landscape. And so there's, the context in which you have to respond is very different from the context with which you might have had to respond, years ago. And so there's all of these changes that are happening, right? And I think the point that I would make to you is that in a changing world, everybody's making decisions, right? The idea of a single top-down decision maker, and I certainly know this, and I'll talk about this a little bit, myself as a CEO, is not one where you can sort of command and control your way through decision making. People are constantly changing within your organization. And even if they're not changing, in fact, they're changing in roles. And the world is changing around them. But even more important than that, the information that's available to them is constantly changing. And perhaps most important is that expertise travels even more slowly than information. So even if you do have information moving at a relatively seamless rate, the people who have knowledge are becoming more specialized, more technocratic, and more knowledge is much more specific than it used to be. And I think the confluence of those events then makes all of us at this conference ask a pretty interesting set of questions, which is how do we want people to make decisions? How do we think about having people make decisions? And there's lots of different models for decision making. And we look at this image and we're like, this is like, of course we're all in the 2020s, and so everybody's making data, decisions based upon data and evidence. But the reality is, almost in every organization, in every modern organization, there's a little bit of every one of these decision-making styles, and probably a couple of others, like consensus-based decision-making, where one, it's follow the leader, right? Another idea is sort of gut instinct, like I'm just, I don't really have any data, so I'm just going to go with what I've historically thought or what I've traditionally sort of thought as a method for solving a problem. Or in many cases, I will look at the data, and maybe the data will even tell me things that I don't believe or I don't know that I believe, and maybe allow me to do things that perhaps I perceive intellectually or otherwise as being wrong. Now, it's funny, I having built an organization over the last 7 years around data, we talk about this at the board level, and our board often says, how do we build a more data-driven decision-making culture within the company? And that's something that we all talk about because we all, would like to make the best decisions possible. And, ironically, of course, that comes at a company that's created a data catalog or, software around using data as optimally as possible. And, we even often joke that, Satyen says, as CEO of a company, as a founder of a company, your name is often used, perhaps not always appropriately. But in many cases, people still in our organization, despite the fact that it's new, despite the fact that it was born and centered around data, despite the fact that we have competency in the world about how to make data-driven decisions and data-driven cultures, we probably have more competency in that than any other organization of our scale, and certainly in about seeing 200 or 300 other organizations worldwide having done it before. And yet these decision-making styles exist. And so as a consequence, we all talk about this thing called data culture, right? So when we think everybody else is going to be making decisions, well, we probably want them to be making the right decisions. So how do we do that? Well, we want to create a data culture, and a data culture is an idea that I think, gets bantered around in lots of discussions, certainly in, consultancies, certainly in the software industry around data and analytics, but it's not entirely clear what that means. And so one of the things that I wanted to try to do was tease out what are the characteristics of a data culture. And so, one idea is the one that we've been talking about. Decision-making is basically distributed. Another very obvious one is that it's evidence-based, that if we're going to be using data and we're going to try to build a culture around it, that we're going to point to evidence. Another one, of course, is that it's non-hierarchical, that the data can come from anywhere. That's a little bit different from distributed, because the idea that all of the decision making and data has to go to, all of the data has to go to a central decision maker is different from having decisions being distributed. But now it gets more interesting on the second level, because then there's an idea of hypothesis and test orientation. Some of the best data cultures that I've seen are ones where people explicitly call out what they're not clear on and realize that those are the areas where they need to be able to gather data or experiment most explicitly. So experimentation becomes a really big part of the culture. Another interesting artifact that we've seen in data cultures is that knowledge is systematically collected and documented. So it's not enough to just produce the final answer. You've got to produce your work and you've got to show your work. And the last piece, and somewhat related to that, is methodological transparency. So, you can document the conclusion, you can document the paper, but you also have to leave the footnotes as well, right? And so this notion of kind of building a data culture isn't just everybody making data decisions based upon data. There's a set of habits, if you will, on the second level that are required in order to be able to make that culture come alive, to make that culture happen. And, we know this because at least, in our own company at Alation, one of the things that we did, not necessarily when we founded the company, this happened about 3 years after we built the company, is that we, documented our own values. And interestingly, 2 of the values of the organization are around measurement, measure ourselves through customer impact, and thinking, listen like you're wrong. And all of that is to sort of recognize that data requires both a measurement orientation, but a little bit of humility to realize that data in fact can be right. Now, of course, being an analytical company, we have a tendency towards sometimes analysis paralysis. And so one of the things that we've done in our values is had a couple of countervailing values around moving the ball to just get stuff done and building for the long term. But these aspects of sort of values and these aspects of how one characterizes a culture, right, are really the work of sort of empowering people to make decisions. And so this is all stuff that I would imagine that everybody that's listening here today is broadly convinced of. Hopefully nothing here is very earth-shattering, but it hopefully gives you some texture and definition to the ideas that a data culture is really something that can be described, can be worked on, and is as much about the humans in your company and how they think about making decisions as it is about which software package you implement or which business processes you implement, and the like. And I would imagine that many of you are also convinced that this is something that's worthwhile doing, because presumably if you weren't, you wouldn't be at this conference. But there are lots of studies to indicate that this is both a priority for many of your peers. Interestingly enough, the #1 priority for chief data officers, which I found fascinating. So therefore, hopefully this is topical to many of you. But that there are lots of compelling benefits to building an organization and an enterprise that can have significant competitive advantage. Okay, so that's my sort of textbook definition, or the sort of theoretical around data culture. But now there's this new term that's arising, and I think it's one that's even perhaps a little bit less mature than the idea of data culture, which is this idea of data intelligence. And this is a term that I've been hearing a lot. And frankly, I had to do a little bit of research myself to go figure out exactly what this idea of data intelligence is, because people are using it, vendors are using it, analysts like IDC are using it. So, what does exactly this data intelligence thing mean? So there's this notion from Google, where I guess the font of all wisdom, as it were, that the intelligence is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills, right? And so interestingly, intelligence isn't about, what I think you commonly think about intelligence being, which is the ability to all of a sudden process information quickly and come back with, a response or a solution or an answer. It's about the ability to acquire and apply the skills, right? So it's not just about application, it's about acquisition of knowledge. And I think that's a very important idea. And so then if you look at this idea of data intelligence, if you sort of just, do word substitution, as it were, I would describe data intelligence as the organizational ability to acquire knowledge and skills with the resulting competitive advantage by leveraging data and analytics. And so the idea there is that you're trying to basically get better at using data and leveraging data in order to be able to build a better enterprise. And I guess the last piece is then that there's this kind of new category of software, or maybe a new grouping, because maybe these software companies existed, of course, for a while, called data intelligence software. And the idea behind this is that it's a category of tools that enables organizations to achieve this thing called data intelligence, right? So we're just kind of defining terms here. Now, I'm going to argue that we've been kind of searching for this idea of data intelligence for a pretty long while. That, if you think about it, there's historically this idea that many of us have heard about, which is called the single source of truth. And in the single source of truth era of data, there's this idea that you could have one semantic layer represented by some of the technologies that you would have seen before. You could have one ETL layer that's going to take data typically from your ERP systems and move them over to your BI layer in your warehouses, and that you've got one set of data infrastructure, right? And I often sort of analogize the single source of truth world as kind of Dan Rather in the nightly news with Peter Jennings. It came to you every single day. The reporting was consistent, but it was kind of slow, and it didn't kind of give you a comprehensive enough picture of your business. And so more recently, we talk a lot about this thing called self-service. And the idea behind self-service is, of course, that there is the ability and empowerment to have people grab their own data. And interestingly enough, in the world of self-service, there's companies and technologies like Tableau and Alteryx and even Hadoop, where you've got schema on read and unstructured data. And the idea is like, let's let everybody have access to the data and let's empower everybody to have access to the compute. And if we do that, we're going to get a lot more information. And just like you have the analogy of sort of Dan Rather and the nightly news, in the self-service era, you've got the analogy of maybe TMZ and Twitter. There's this concept that sort of anybody can produce a fact. Now, just like you kind of trusted Dan Rather in the nightly news, you sometimes can trust things that are coming out of TMZ and Twitter. It's certainly a lot faster, but it's maybe not necessarily always reliable. Now, today, I think we've got this problem, which is we've been searching for all this truth. We've been searching for all of this information, but we've got so much complexity born out of all that change that I sort of mentioned at the very outset of this discussion, and also born out of all of the technology that we've tried to implement in order to both gain competitive advantage and contend with all of that change, that information itself is really, really hard to find, really, really hard to understand, and really, really hard to trust. And so the problem that all of us are facing in this quest for data intelligence is complexity. We're getting smarter, but the world's getting more complicated, right? And so, we're struggling effectively to keep up. And, interestingly enough, the truth, of course, now isn't the singular thing. It's this thing that exists in a lot of different places, and it largely depends on your point of view. Your truth can exist in systems. So there can be a truth according to the procurement department, which is different from the truth according to the finance department, which contains the procurement department, and there may be a truth in the sales department that's totally different. And every one of these systems is on some level a mask for a perspective on truth. Now, I personally come from the world of economics. I was trained in economics. That was where I did my undergrad and graduate work. And so, you get this in academia. There are lots of different journals and lots of different papers, and lots of different papers can be, published and offered to multiple different journals. And so all of those papers then cite previous articles from those journals. And so you see this truth idea as this evolutionary thing. And you need, basically an index in academia, it's called JSTOR, in order to be able to access all of these prior articles and their abstracts to understand what you can reference in the past and what are the commonly used papers that people would need to know. And so from a software perspective, if you think about this, how do you get to this intelligence? How do you get to this idea of the data intelligence? Well, there's a couple of different artifacts, and not surprisingly, these artifacts link to these enablers around this concept of data culture. One of them, relating to distribution, is having the right information at the right time. Another one is that you're able to link to evidence. Another one is that you're able to have open access to the data, to the extent that it's legally permitted. Another is that you're able to test multiple scenarios. Another one is that there is documentation around the pros of what the claims happen to be, not just a report. And another one of them is that a lot of those claims, when they're made, are traceable to not only the prior data sets, but also to all of the assumptions that were made around coming up with those results, right? And so if you think about it, you don't really, in this quest for intelligence, actually need a single source of truth in a world where the physical information, where all of the baseline sort of evidence is distributed. What you really need is a single system of reference, because that system of reference can give you a lot of these capabilities. The intelligence comes out of your ability to sort of constantly learn and constantly apply the knowledge that your organization has. And so what you need is not necessarily one system to contain every fact that your organization knows, but rather one system that can refer to every fact that you happen to know. And so, when I broadly define the idea of data intelligence, or when we think about the idea of data intelligence, it includes lots of different types of software, right? So if you think about sort of the IDC definition, there are lots of different vendors that, can market and sell things that have the ability to provide data intelligence, because that intelligence can come from a lot of different sources. Checking any one of these various boxes can come from a variety of different sources. But when you think about sort of full enablement of that data intelligence, I'm now getting to the point of this argument, which is that really the data catalog is something that allows you to get to that point. And obviously we're a catalog vendor, so I'll disclose that, and I'm sure many of you already knew that coming in, but stay with me here for the argument. So at Alation, we talk about our vision, as every company, would talk about their own vision, and ours is to empower a curious and rational world. Not surprisingly, I've talked a lot about science, scientific thinking. And so the reason why, most of the 300 people that come to work at Alation every day come to work is because we want to empower people to think more scientifically. And that's born out of a data culture. And then there are these ideas that, sort of feed into a data culture: data literacy, the ability to search for and discover data, the ability to be able to do so in a compliant and ethical and, well-governed way. All of this kind of feeds into a data culture, and many of those boxes can map into one or more of these categories. And so you would know a data catalog, as something very physical, right? When you think of a data catalog, there's a somewhat well-accepted definition of a data catalog. And so typically it's going to be a repository that contains metadata across an organization for different sources of data. There's the search and discovery element, there's the data governance element, there's a collaboration element that enables this discovery. And typically a catalog would catalog, as a verb, a wide variety of information assets. So you can have data sets and tables, but you can also have things like articles and glossary terms. You can also have things like reports. You can also have things like queries, which are of course an abstraction, not a physical set of data, but a logical container of data. Visualizations and conversations. And so there's a set of common capabilities, but most of it is sort of oriented around this concept of search and discovery. And broadly, right, it's used by data consumers, and people are answering a couple of core questions. How do I find information? How can I use this information? How should this information be used? And should I be somebody who's using it, right? So it gives you context, right? And I speak about this maybe with a little bit of expertise, because a lot of people, in this case, Forrester, have given Alation credit for starting or at least commercializing the data catalog trend. I won't say that I and we invented the category or the concept overall, but I would tell you that certainly the commercialization was something that we were out in front of, and it was largely born out of my experience at Oracle. Like I was at Oracle. I delivered and built analytical software. And in the process of doing that, often I'd end up, seeing how much of a mess of data there was within our companies, but more fundamentally, how people didn't really know how to use it at our customers. And the idea of sort of this knowledge management system, this cataloging system, came to mind, right? Now, one thing that you should ask, if you haven't already, is that why does this category exist in a world where metadata management and data governance software existed many years prior to that, right? We've been talking about things like data governance and metadata management for a pretty long time. And one of the analogies that I often give to people when they ask this question is that it's kind of the difference between, if you think about Amazon, the folks that are working on the warehouse floor versus the folks that are shopping at Amazon.com. At Amazon.com, you've got people who are information or product consumers, and they're really trying to engage with the products. They want to read the reviews. They want to see how many other people are browsing for these products. They want to know what other people have browsed for. They want to know other people's social rankings and reviews. And they want to get a lot of suggestions, because maybe if they're about to buy, one television set, there's another television set that might be slightly better, right? None of that capability, or a lot of that capability, doesn't matter at all to the person that is supplying the information, the person that is sitting on that warehouse floor, trying to provide the box and put it into a shipping container so it can get shipped out of the distribution center, those folks need completely different things. They need to know how big the boxes are, where the boxes happen to be located. Now, interestingly, in that world, right, people often talk about system of records, because if you're managing inventory, you better know where that inventory is. If you're managing inventory, you better know what's the last in and what's the first out. If you're managing inventory, you better know how much things cost. You better know when things are going to expire. And often, therefore, in data, people talk about a data system of record. But the realization with a catalog is you don't really need a system of record, right? What you really need on top of the system of record, which you probably already have, is a system of engagement, right? Because what you're really trying to do is to get people to engage with the data. What you're really trying to do is to get people to come to the data and talk about it and describe what they've done with it and describe how it might be useful or not useful, or describe how high quality it might be. And so that engagement is really what distinguishes the catalog and what it has become versus this sort of traditional system of kind of supplier management around data, about data management, traditionally used by folks that are data managers. Now, these catalogs, as they've come to exist, have allowed you to self-serve. And so, we've thought about these things from a consumption perspective. Now, what I would argue to you, and I think this is perhaps maybe, if you take nothing else away from this talk, the most important thing is that, if you think about Amazon and kind of draw that analogy a bit further, Amazon reinvented the supply chain, right? Most recently, if you saw this particular Wall Street Journal article, but there's a lot of coverage around this, Amazon's been saying that they're actually looking to talk to Simon Property Group, which is a very large mall owner and operator, to basically take over former Sears and JCPenney stores, because now they want to turn them all into fulfillment centers, right? So they've basically turned the entire world on its head, right? They understood the entire supply chain, they understood the demand aspect, and therefore have been able to completely transform the supply chain, right? And I would argue to you that that's exactly what is happening today in the world of data management. That what we need to do is really better understand what people are looking for, what people are searching for, how people are thinking about data, because that sort of demand understanding around data is what will allow you to really manage the data in a scale order way better, right? And that is basically the fundamental argument, that the data catalog is therefore, because of its core understanding of consumption patterns, because of its core understanding systematically of the data, an ideal platform for this thing that we called data intelligence. Now, as I mentioned, the early, and just to kind of talk about the software now, taking the sort of, if you will, conceptual argument and moving it down to the world of software, maybe I can give you a little bit more of a description around what that actually looks like. So early data catalogs were basically all about search and discovery. And a big part of that was machine learning. We basically drew a lot of inference in order to make the search work really well. And often I use this analogy of PageRank with Google as a similar analogy, because Google used social signal in order to indicate which web pages were the ones that are most likely to engage your search. But we also did a lot of stuff around engagement and adoption, because in terms of getting people to get a search and discovery system that was going to work, one of the really critical things that we needed to do was get all the metadata up to date. And then the only way to do that was to get people to engage with the data and to adopt the system. And so to do that, you basically had to get a lot of immediacy with the software, usability, measurement, and the content had to be, constantly up to date. And so if you think about kind of this original version, what you really were trying to do with the data catalog is create a search and discovery single source of reference. Now, those capabilities, I will argue, are fundamentally the same things that you need to get to data intelligence, because by having that core consumption capability, by having that core engagement, what you've done is allowed all of the data management capabilities around managing where your data lives, around managing how your data is governed, around complying with different regulations, inclusive of privacy. All of those things require you to have an understanding of the demand for data. And so, not surprisingly, more recently, we've gotten into the space of data governance, where we've really started implementing policies as an overlay on top of the catalog of data, in order to be able to say, look, this policy can be applied, not necessarily top down in a way that's entirely about human workflow, but rather bottoms up by looking at patterns within the data to be able to understand where the policy ought to be applied and what people ought to be doing with the data. And so if you think about sort of this application of information and knowledge to the data, really this notion of policy intersecting with how people are actually using the data is a really critical advance on how one thinks about how to govern their data and how to think about how policies can be applied at scale in a constantly evolving and changing enterprise. Another good application of sort of signal to data is, in the area of cloud data migration. If you think about it, many of you are probably either, somewhat through, partially on the way of, or maybe even in some cases complete with moving a lot of your data or some of your data to the cloud. And if that's the case, one of the big questions is, what data do I have to move? And so how would you figure that out? Well, one great idea would be to understand social signal. One great idea would be able to understand what are people actually looking for and learning from. And so even in this case of kind of managing your data in terms of the physicality of the data and which infrastructure is optimal for the data, you can really learn from understanding what the demand side of the equation looks like in order to figure out what the supply would look like. And so my basic argument to you here is that, catalogs provide, lots of intelligence. And I think, as you kind of consider, catalogs within your architecture, consider how that architecture is going to evolve and consider how you're going to be more responsive to the demand over the course of not today, but many, many years. Because the world of change is going to be, constantly coming at you, and, you're going to have the ability to react. Now, as I think about catalogs, we're going to go, to a lot of different places. And so happy to talk about some of these topics as we move forward. But there's a lot of exciting developments in the world of data intelligence that I think we're excited to think about. But for that, I'll probably pause and leave it to questions. I don't think I've left a lot of time, but hopefully I've left, at least a lot of thoughts that, we can dive up on either in the booth or in a follow-up session. Thank you. And Elizabeth, I'll hand it back to you for questions. So first question is, how important to good cataloging is good data profiling, provenance, and health measures? So I would say the answer is it's important, but it's not a prerequisite. I think often in the world of data management, perfect is the enemy of the good. And so what I find is that customers often find a case where they say, look, I want to organize all my data. I want to profile all of my data. I want to, assign a health score to all of my data so that people don't ever use the data incorrectly. Of course, in a world of change, what data happens to be high quality today may be the low quality data tomorrow. And so that evolution can be quite rapid. And so, what we generally recommend is to catalog first and then improve based upon, which data sets are most important over time. And so the data sets that are being used the most often, that have the most relationship to, some governance initiative that you might be implementing, that are ones that may move the business forward the most critically, those are the ones to profile and measure most critically and most deeply. But what we find is that the ones that perhaps are less relevant could be, distractions to the effort of getting, to build a data culture and to have, ultimate data intelligence. So I'd say important, but not necessarily a prereq. The next question that I've got, Elizabeth, do you want to read these or did you? Yeah, I think you're on mute. I think the question is, how often have we seen org change management in our work? I think she's on mute. So in our case, we see it, I'd say we'd see it in about a third of the cases. I think it really depends on where a customer and a particular organization happens to be on the maturity curve. There are organizations that are sort of, if you will, at the level of maturity where the first thing they really need to do is react to either a legal or a regulatory requirement. And often what they're doing is just really try to take inventory. And in many of those cases, there's very little org and change management. There are organizations that, perhaps have bought lots of data technologies, but haven't implemented them appropriately. And in many of those cases, that becomes the catalyst for org management. And then there are organizations that are sort of on the other side of the organizational change, but need to just grapple with all of the data they have. And so often it's sort of the mid-maturity customers that are the ones that are doing organizational change most critically. And so that's what we've seen in our work. And we do, typically partner with system integrators like Accenture or Capgemini, where that's an important idea.
Excellent. Okay, we do have more coming in. How do catalogs support the setup and maintenance of common management metrics and analytics, like cost of goods sold or unit cost?
Yeah. So often the first step in sort of harmonizing metrics or coming up with a single library of metrics or coming up with at least with the distinguishing characteristics of it is to understand where those metrics happen to live. And often those metrics happen to live both in source systems and in analytical systems, and often in just sort of, dashboards and reporting systems. And so the first thing that catalogs do is just help you discover where all of those definitions happen to live. The second thing, once you've discovered them, then the question becomes which one of these is right and which one of these is wrong. Now, it may be that multiple are right to the end of having multiple versions of the truth, but only in certain contexts. So different departments might have different definitions used at different times. And so we help with search and discovery. We also help with rationalization. And then, of course, we help with the backside of search and discovery, which is once you've done the rationalization, you want people to discover the right things and not use the wrong things. And we help sort of through that life cycle and process.
I think this might be a really good question. One question is, data catalog has been super hard, multiple initiatives, but very little progress to showcase. What's the magic wand?
Yeah, so I think part of the magic wand is realizing that there isn't a magic wand on some level. I think that there's so much. I think the thing that we believe at Alation is that the biggest problem is engagement and adoption. And so, to the extent that you have any particular ML feature, any particular search feature, any particular governance feature, all of that matters at a point. But what really matters is that people actually sign up for and use and engage with the system and the software and want to engage and use the system and the software, which means that people have to be bought into that initiative. There's a lot that we've learned over the course of rolling out this catalog at 200 organizations. And the most important thing is that it's got to be measurable. There's got to be people that are dedicated to making the change, and you've got to sell to the initiated, which means, there's going to be lots of naysayers in your organization that don't want to do it. As controversial as this may sound, don't start with them. Don't try to win them over. Go for small wins, and it'll snowball into big ones. Beyond that, I could talk to you for probably 3 or more of these sessions about different techniques and adoption. But I think a big part of the realization is A, engagement and adoption is the problem. B, there is no magic wand.
Excellent. So can you expand on searching for the truth? It sounds like it's not the focus of the data journey.
I mean, on some level, why do we use data? We use data, if we think about sort of epistemology and the nature of knowledge, we use data because we want to be more knowledgeable. And on some level, that knowledge is, on some level, the search for the truth, right? So I think, fundamentally, the data journey is all about enabling people to get to the answer faster. Now, there are lots of different ways to use data. There's, you want to be compliant. You want to make sure that you are, using it appropriately and ethically. And in many cases, those are journeys that are sort of, influencing that ultimate journey. But I do very much think that if you're on the road of sort of data maturity and data management, what you're fundamentally, hopefully trying to do is get people in your organization and your organization more broadly to be smarter and more intelligent, as it were. So that's how I would relate those ideas.
Wonderful. Now, I think this probably is the last question. We only have a couple of minutes left. What would you focus on in all of this data management really be? What would the focus of all of this really be? We must seek buy-in from the organization.
Yeah, I think that to the extent that you're sitting in an organization and you're looking for buy-in, often what I tell people is that there is permission and then there's forgiveness. And you're not going to get 100% of your organization typically to buy in day one. That's a pretty tall order. And so what we've found is that it is a lot about sort of finding the tribe that's sort of most convinced, making those individuals successful, and then success itself can become a snowball. And one of the analogies that I'll use is I was once in a redevelopment talk with a woman who was responsible for redevelopment in San Francisco in the south of Market District. And I'm from, I live in the Bay Area. And she said, day one, nobody wants to do this work. Day two, you convince, a couple of store owners and you've got a block transformed. Day three, you've got to get people to figure out how to not come in so fast that they ruin everything that you've built. And, I think on some level, these data management journeys are all about sort of, change management. And I think it goes back to the org process. That's me with my timer telling me to stop talking. And so I'll do that. But I do think there's an evolutionary process, and you've got to start with the converted.
Well, I think that quote towards the end of your conversation really hit home. Find your tribe, right? Many hands make the work light, and you're going to need all the help you can get. So excellent. Thank you very much for your time today. I personally learned a lot, and from the questions, you had a lot of engagement, and it seems like other people were getting a lot out of it as well. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.